very much. Sorry for running a bit late. It's entirely my fault. I just take the blame for it. It's simpler that way. It keeps the team happy. Everybody's happy. Then they all know that everything goes wrong is my fault. It's the default position. Yeah? Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for support for Anna, and thank you, Rachel, for all the work you do in our shadow team, and all the work you do as an absolutely brilliant MP for York. The way that she stands up for the people of her constituency and the issues they face, particularly flooding and the environmental issues that they face, but also the work she does in our transport team to try and bring about a more rational and sensible way of running things. We're on a campaign tour all around the country at the moment because we don't quite know when an election will come. I wish I could tell you. All I know is let's have it soon. Let's get it over with. Let's get on with it. In getting on with it, we've got to set out our stall and set it out ourselves and set it out campaigning ourselves, because a lot of the media are not going to do it for us and will not report reasonably or fairly what we say or what we do. The issues that we face as a country are huge. First of all, let's look at the huge global issue of our natural world and our environment. On May the 1st, I proposed to Parliament on behalf of the Labour Party that the British Parliament become the first in the world to declare a climate emergency. And I put that forward because of the loss of habitat, the loss of species, the global warming that's happening, the environmental refugees that are escaping from horrible situations all around the world, and the obvious problems faced in this country. Yes, we signed the Paris Climate Change Accords. They are not being adhered to by many countries, particularly the USA and President Trump, and our own emissions do not lead us to the place we ought to go to, which is by having zero emissions by 2050. Something else has to be done. So I proposed that a climate emergency be declared, and that was agreed by Parliament. Thanks. Well, agreed by Parliament eventually, because the Conservatives didn't really quite know how to oppose it. They didn't agree with it, particularly because I put it forward, but they couldn't find a way to oppose it, so it was carried. And that meant that Labour proposed on a climate emergency, climate crisis, became the first Parliament in the world to do so, and I think the Labour Party should be proud of that by achieving that. So that gives us a very important task ahead of us, and that is how we bring about that huge step change in environmental thinking and sustainability. And so each of our shadow teams, all of them, have been asked by me to bring forward their own plans and proposals as to how they would adhere to the climate change accords and bring about a safer world. And we put the same requirement on the government, which they've got to come back to by November the 1st. It could even be a Labour government by then, and we'd be happy to answer those questions at that time. However, it does mean that we've got to invest in the future, and therefore we've set up a group of Becky Long-Bailey, Sue Heyman and Barry Gardner to lead work on the Green Industrial Revolution. Becky in particular has been hosting events all over the country about climate change, but also about investment for the future, so that we change the energy basis of this country in a sustainable way and create the skilled jobs for the future. Hence my support for the Mersey Tidal Barrage, the Swansea Lagoon project, and a whole host of improved wind generation, wave generation electricity, as well as solar. And with that, we actually create a lot of jobs, and you create a whole spin-off from it. Think of the spin-off of effective university research that has on local development and business. That happens at York, yes, also happens in Swansea and a number of other places. We think 400,000 jobs will be created by a green industrial revolution. And so it's up to us to do this at a local level as well as at a national level, inspiring people to come up with their ideas and do that campaigning work at a local level. And I'm very proud of what we've achieved, but we've got an awful lot more to do, so that we face the future of the dangers of this world in a way of changing our thinking and changing the way we do things. But environmental issues and climate emergencies don't fall evenly on people. The poorest people in the poorest parts of this country have the worst air, the worst housing conditions, and the shortest life expectancy. People living in the cleanest parts of the country with the highest incomes and the best housing live longer. Health inequalities are not new. They've been there for a very long time and need to be challenged. Indeed, it was the previous Labour governments that tried to challenge them. It'll be an incoming Labour government that will invest fairly across the country in the health needs. But it's also about what we do over air quality and air pollution. Children growing up alongside the most polluting streets in the world have shorter life expectancies and lose lung capacity before even they've reached the age of 5. That has to change. And so I'm determined that our party will lead this campaign, lead this work, and it can only be done by the work that we do in every community and every part of the country. And I'm sure you'll be doing all of that in York, in both the constituencies. And across the world, we will not be bowing down in front of Donald Trump and offering to do a sweetheart trade deal with him. We will work with our friends in the United States, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and many others, on the work they're doing on the Green New Deal that they're putting forward, not that different to the things that we're saying, and that whole movement in the United States and all across Europe is achieving those things. But we'll also be standing up to this government. Boris Johnson, having taken office only a week ago, seems to be determined that we will leave the EU on the 31st of October with no deal. It would be utterly and absolutely catastrophic if he's allowed to get away with that. We will do absolutely everything we can and have a chance to stop no deal. To stop no deal because of what it would do immediately to food prices, what it would do to manufacturing industry sales, and in the direction in which it would lead us. Johnson seems to glory in the approval of Donald Trump, and indeed apparently quite enjoys being called Britain's Trump. Whatever. The idea behind it is actually far more sinister than just the playing around with names. It is the direction he wants to take this country. The direction is to a trade deal with the United States. And in case he hadn't noticed, President Trump does America first big time. President Trump does trade treaties, America first big time. And so he would therefore want trade access to Britain for American companies. The price would be huge. The price would be deregulation of our food standards and agricultural systems so that GM crops and so on can be imported from the United States. It would be reducing the workers' rights that we have enshrined in legislation, limited as they are from the European Union, and it would be about reducing environmental protections. And also it's about protection of American corporations in this country and elsewhere if they're trading with them on what they call investor protection, which is protection against any legislative changes that they believe to be harmful to the interests of those companies. This is very dangerous stuff indeed. And so, the day Parliament goes back, we'll be back on the tack of absolutely opposing the idea of leaving with no deal. And if Johnson tries to force that through, then we will put in a proposal immediately for a referendum to be held with a choice of remain or leave with no deal, in which case we would vote to remain within the European Union. These are very, very serious issues indeed, and I want to be working with people who have an agenda of social change and social justice across this continent and indeed across the world. And that means working with parties that are standing up against the economics of austerity, but above all the political choice of what austerity is. And the fundamentals that we put forward in the 2017 election campaign were opposition to austerity. Opposition to austerity because of what it's done to this country ever since 2010. Just think back to those days. Yes, there had been the financial crisis. Yes, there had been a massive problem that problem is best addressed by investment in the future, by making sure there is spending power in the pockets of everybody and dealing with the social inequalities that we have. Instead, that government took the decision, with the support of the Liberal Democrats, that they would pass George Osborne's budget, which did a number of things: slashed local government expenditure, froze health expenditure, froze public sector wages, and put forward a social security bill that was smaller than the last one. In other words, the poorest and most vulnerable people reliant on benefits had their income cut by an incoming government. And as we went on, things got worse. Student fees rose to £9,000 a year, and local authority expenditure continued to be capped and cut. And what's the result of that all these years later? 1 million people waiting for social care, tens of thousands, nay hundreds of thousands of former students saddled with debts of over £50,000 and getting worse as a result of that as they've sold on the student loan book. What's the consequences in housing? An unprecedented number of rough sleeping homeless around the country, and an even greater number, a much greater number of people who are concealed homeless, either grotesquely overcrowded or sofa surfing homeless. And at the same time, a government that's promoting the construction of luxury flats, particularly in London and the South East, that are sold off-plan to overseas investors and kept empty as a result of it. And the current Prime Minister was absolutely part and parcel of that problem and that issue. Whenever Labour-controlled authorities in London challenged Boris Johnson on the approvals he was giving to development, saying, in the case of my own local authority, we want social housing, not speculative luxury private accommodation, he brushed all that aside and signed the land over to the private investors to develop these obscenely expensive flats that are never going to be occupied because they're just a cash machine against the future. That is the character of the Prime Minister and the government that we've got. And so, we have huge challenges ahead of us as a party, how we deal with these issues when we go into government. One, on housing, providing the resources and the loan capabilities to local authorities to build 500,000 council houses over the first period of that Labour government, to deal with the housing and ending right to buy, because what right to buy is done in so many places is actually providing a basis for the private rented market to take over. I mean, I'm sure all of you know former council homes and flats that are being privately rented out for a multiple of 2 and 3 times the level the council would have charged for the rent had they remained in council ownership. Secondly, regulation of the private rented sector with longer tenancies, rent control and good quality environmental standards. It is about good quality housing being developed that is high efficiency in the use of energy, and as far as I'm concerned, every new building constructed anywhere should have solar panels on the roof to reduce energy costs as well. Then, the issues facing our health service are, as you know, partly the restriction of funding, but also the horrible consequences of the Health and Social Care Act, which encourages private companies to take over parts of the NHS and run them as outsourced contracts. And the ludicrous position we seem to have got into, where a company announces that it wants to take over part of an NHS services, isn't granted a contract, and then proceeds to sue the NHS for not being granted a contract. So Richard Branson, in one of his ramblings, tells us that he thinks there's greater things in life than worrying about money. And I said, well, I'm sure there probably are, but in this case, will he be kind enough to pay back to the NHS the money he's got to So it is about the way in which we run our health service and ending privatisation and outsourcing within it. The numbers of people that are working for outsourced companies in the NHS being paid far below the wages they would get were they public sector employees. We need fairness in this country and respect for everyone that works in the NHS, be they cleaners, nurses, doctors or consultants. They're all part of the NHS. The other issue that many people face social care crisis is very, very serious within our society. Social care denied to around 1 million people waiting for it. Private social care homes closing down because they can't make any money or enough money out of it, and local authorities having either sold off or not able to provide that care. There has to be a national care service properly funded to make sure that everyone that needs social care gets it and they don't become a burden on the relatives around them. The social pressures and the personal pressures are unbelievable, as many of you I'm sure would know. When you've got an older person who needs social care and suddenly the rest of the family is realising the massive costs that could be involved in it for them. We've got to give people the security they need and want in the same way that we do within the National Health Service. I personally, passionately believe in good quality education. Education should be a liberation, education should be an inspiration, education should be something that people want to enjoy and young people want to enjoy. However, whilst we do have free schools and we do have free secondary schools and so on, in the sense of not having to pay for them, at both ends of the scale, charging has come in. Charging for nursery education, charging for post-school education. And we've looked and talked about this a great deal. And in shorthand, our proposals are to establish a national education service, so the legacy of the next Labour government will be a national education service in the same way the legacy of the 1945 government was a national health service. The principle being that education is a right, not a privilege, a right to enjoy at any time and throughout glory life. Therefore, 20 hours nursery education free for all children, free school meals for all primary schools, a pupil arts premium in all primary schools so that every child gets to learn a musical instrument and the poetry that goes with it, and an end to university fees, college fees and adult education fees by raising corporate taxation sufficiently in order to pay for it. We put that forward in 2017 and we'll put that forward again because it's what we believe in. But it's also about opportunities. I think there's far too much stress and competition goes into education, and that's why, after consultation with the NEU and many others working in the teaching profession, we've decided, Angela Rain and myself announced that we would end SATS testing at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. Both to the children and to the teachers. And I get very uncomfortable about this sort of level of competition between schools on league table-itis, as I called it, which puts huge pressure on the school, on the teachers and the individuals, and unfortunately means that there's pressure on to concentrate on the students that are going to achieve the best exam results and not those who need the most support. Every child deserves the best we can give them, irrespective of the grade they're likely to get or not get in an examination. That's what teachers want, that's what we want, and that is what a national education service will make sure actually happens. And I say this because I believe it very strongly, that whilst I want everyone that can benefit from and get to a university to go to university and study and get the degree that they want, that's good. We also want to make sure that every other young person also gets the chance to undertake a vocational course and apprenticeship, and we treat it with equal value to those who are I think these things are very important. And so it is about educating people, but it's also about how we develop our economy. John McDonnell has led the way on the anti-austerity movement, and so it's quite interesting that the debate is very little now about the importance of austerity, as Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt spent a month touring the Tory party membership across the country and suddenly discovering that there was a lack of funding on health, a lack of funding on education,